Okay, seniors, here we go. We're getting deep into book 4 and closing up on this book. As I'm looking at it, the finished part where I finished reading, we have very little left after today. And I know that most of you who actually took the time to read this book and go through it are probably sick of it at this point. This is not a book that has a lot of people who enjoy it per se, but I think it's something we need to study. All right, I just think it's important, especially in the world we live in today. I want to point out that just because it's relevant today, because of, while I'm filming this anyway, of coronavirus, it's still relevant at all times. All right, it's not just a let's compare it to what's going on in the world today. There's so much more you can do with this book than just that. All right, so let me get kind of squared up here on the page we're going to be on. We're looking at book 4, sections, I believe 4, 5, and 6 today. Yeah, 4, 5, and 6. So we're going to start out with kind of a big section. I told you earlier when Father Pantalou first steps up, and does his initial speech, I told you there's going to be another one later in the book that kind of bookended it, and that's this one. All right? Pantalou has been surrounding himself with death. He's been doing everything he can to work extra shifts on these teams. He's been helping Ryu. He has been surrounded with death and plague. He is not hiding out in his chapel. He is out there doing things. And for the most part, it's not really impacted him. Not impacted him in a negative way. He definitely is showing that he's backing up what he says. But then with the death of Jacques, which is the name of Othan's son, the guy who died in the previous chapters, he is visibly shaken. All right? Let's see if I can find a good thing for you. Here we go. It says he had elected for the place among his fellow workers that he judged incumbent upon him in the forefront of the fight, and constantly since then he had rubbed shoulders with death. He was well aware that at any moment death might claim him too, and he had given thought to this. Outwardly he had lost nothing of his serenity, but from the day on which he saw a child die, something seemed to change in him. So it says, this kind of performance had lost its novelty for our townsfolk. They're talking about, we'll get to that in a minute. That wasn't a Pantalou statement. So Pantalou is really impacted by this, and we're going to see it, okay? Now, we also know something about religion for these poor townspeople. They've kind of abandoned traditional religion at this point. I'm sure they still go to church stuff because it's become a habit, but they're replacing it with basically superstition at this point. You know, they're wearing around certain medals and stuff they think will help because they're just they've been praying and nothing's happened, so now they're moving on to the next thing they're going to try. They've set these arbitrary days. They think it's going to end. They think that this is going to end in spring, and as closer it gets to spring and the less it seems to be ending, the more upset they get and the more they start trying all sorts of crazy superstitions to get this thing to pass. Think about us when we kept talking about how we thought this was going to be over. Remember I'm going to stutter through this. I'm going over this right now with students in August. I remember when the pandemic for coronavirus began when we really hit its stride in March, and we were all talking about how it was going to regress in the summer because of the heat, and then it was going to spike again in the winter when it got cold. And here we are in August, the dead heat of the summer, and this joker hasn't slowed down a bit. So we have a lot of similarity to these people. We set all these arbitrary ideas and beliefs that were going to happen, which there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're just basing it on precedents, but we were hoping for these things, and when they didn't happen, it kind of hurt a lot of people. So at this point, Pantalou gets up to speak again, and while now his church is obviously not near as full because of people dying and people just abandoning any kind of religion, a lot of things change in this. It's a noticeably different tone. First of all, it seems like a small thing, but it's not. Instead of referring to it as people as you, which is what he did when he was talking at them, he is now saying we. He is part of this. It's not a you're sinners and you deserve what you got. It's we are in this together. So we've talked a lot about the idea of abandoning the self and becoming part of a community, and he's definitely on that. He also speaks more placidly. He's not thundering to these people. I mean, he's understanding it now. Now, I want to point out as we get into this that I'm not saying I agree with everything Pantalou says. I'm trying to tell you what he says. And, even my version of it is a little bit sketchy, to be honest with you, because this is my first time through the book. So feel free to have issue with it and point out things that you think are different, all right? So he starts out with some of the things that and this is the way our argument should be. You start out with things that people will believe, and then you slowly drag them along to some new ideas. And trust me, he ends this on a pretty hard to take opinion. All right, he starts out with the all trials. I wrote trails in my notes. All trials work to the betterment for the Christian. Now, this is a term, this is a phrase that's constantly butchered, okay? It doesn't mean maybe the individual. We're talking about Christians in general and the faith in general and to God and to his glory. It doesn't mean it's always going to end perfectly for the individual, all right? But Panelou's kind of taking that stance. He says that our goal is not to explain the plague, which is what he was trying to do in the first speech, but instead to learn a lesson from it. What are we supposed to take from this? He points out that suffering should not be discounted or ignored. You can't say that it's all, the good that's going to come out of this is worth it. He says human suffering is too powerful for us to just throw it away that way, which after watching a child die, I don't know how you can react any way differently. He points out that in a time of plague, religions can't be a pick and choose type of thing. It's all or nothing, which really goes back to something he learned in the conversation with Ryu, because that's how he feels, but not about religion, just about behavior in general. These two are very similar in their beliefs, which is kind of interesting how that's drawn up here at the end, that the religious man who's going to tell us basically that you have to learn to love the plague in some ways is going to parallel the doctor who's doing everything he can to fight it, but yet they're so much more similar than we might want to make them seem. And that's on purpose, okay? He truly believes that suffering, even of the young, is God's will and therefore should be ours as well. This is where he starts to really push some different type of thinking. He instructs the people to bend to divine will. If it's God's will that the plague endures and people die from it, then we have to accept it, is what he says. He seems to accept the same premise that Ryu has come to. Even if it requires stumbling blindly in the dark, it's our job to do the best we can in the space we are given, and after that, trust in God and his goodness. So like my sign right here. They believe fully that whatever your situation, do the best you can, whether it's small and that's all you can do, or whether you have the potential and the resources to do large good things, but you should do them. And I can't say I disagree with that part of this at all. He says all must choose to either love or hate God in this moment, and to love him requires full surrender, even to the plague, okay? Which, interestingly enough, is what he is about to do. Although there's something unique that happens. Let me hit this Teru part, though, first. On page 229... find it here. Teru says, when an innocent youth can have his eyes destroyed, a Christian should either lose his faith or consent to having his eyes destroyed. Panelu declines to lose his faith, and he will go through with it to the end. That's what he meant to say. So he's basically saying that it's the job of a Christian in the plague to accept whatever comes. If that means getting the plague and dying, then you get the plague and you do your best while you have it. And while I said I'm not totally sure if that's the way this should come off, that's a little bit harsh. Panelu is not playing. He definitely, something weird happens after this. And I hope you read this carefully. I hope you read it at all, but I hope you read this carefully. Mysteriously, Panelu starts getting sick at this point, immediately afterwards. And the symptoms he's showing are not of plague. They're things that don't accompany this particular type of plague. I mean, there's some, but for the most part, he's got something else, and they really can't figure out what. He refuses to call a doctor because he's basically saying, I'm going to take whatever I'm given, and I'm not going to fight it. Eventually, he gets so sick that the person he's staying with calls, and Ryu shows up. It's really too late. But Panelu kind of hangs around for a while, and Ryu's baffled by the symptoms. He can't figure out what it is, but he does say that he's not going to survive. He knows that Panelu is doing what he wants to do, and he wants to die. And not because he's depressed, and not because he has no hope, but because he feels that is what his duty is at this point, is to die with this plague. And die he does. He dies mysteriously but peacefully, clutching his crucifix as he goes. Now, you don't have a lot of action in this book, but this is a section that does have a lot of suspense, really, in my opinion, as we see this mysterious illness that takes out one of our main characters, the first, I believe, of our main characters to drop dead. We are going to have a couple of more as the book closes, all right? That does get us through Section 4, though. Section 5. We have as All Souls Day arrives, which from what I can gather from looking at the book is sort of like a festival for the dead, except for this particular year, they're going to decide not to celebrate the dead because, well, they've been dealing with the dead all year and they don't want to think more about them. So skipping the festivities this year. They point out that for them, each day is the Day of the Dead. One of the doctors, Dr. Richard or Ricard, I'm sure it's not pronounced Richard, dies at this point, and that also impacts the people because it looks like some of the medicine is starting to do better, and then one of the doctors dies, and that kind of changes their optimism back to pessimism, and we have a lot of bad stuff ahead for these people. Food begins to run short. Especially for the poor people. The rich are still able to get whatever they want, but the poor are starting to, run out of resources. So demonstrations begin, and you see the beginnings of what will turn into, in the next section, rioting. And lots of bad is shaping up. The newspapers are ordered by the local people that they can't print negative stories. They have to be all optimistic. And we can argue in class about whether that's a good or bad thing to do. People start looking at the walls that are surrounding them, and now they're really focusing on those walls, and that's dangerous. People on the outside are looking at it, and they're blocking them from seeing the suffering inside, which is good for them, but the people on the inside are looking and imagining what people are doing on the outside, just their day-to-day life, and they're becoming exceptionally jealous because at this point, they just wish life would go back to the boring old normal. Sorry about that. My email just decided to hit. Let me get that out of there. All right. At this point, Rambert and Theroux decide to visit one of these quarantine camps. It's actually the one that Othon's at, and they run into him. They're just trying to see what it's like there, and they realize life there is pretty sorry. These people aren't living in good conditions. They don't trust each other, so there's not even the benefit of like being there with a bunch of people and being able to have the joy of each other's company. They don't trust each other. It's really silent. People are just listless. They're doing nothing, and it's a really uncomfortable situation. In fact, let me give you page 240. Theroux says, but worst of all is that they're forgotten, and they know it. Their friends have forgotten them because they have other things to think about, naturally enough. And those they love have forgotten them because all their energies are devoted to making schemes and taking steps to get them out of camp. And by dint of always thinking about these schemes and steps, they have ceased thinking about those whose release they're trying to secure. So he points out these people don't trust each other, and now they realize that their loved ones have even forgotten them. What a horrible thing to have happen. At this point, you would think getting the plague and dying is a positive for these people. Okay? They come across Othon at this point. Othon asks about his son. That's when we get his son's name is Jacques, and he asks about suffering, and they lie to him and tell him he didn't suffer, which, of course, we read that part. He suffered greatly. Okay? So that's section 5. It's really just to get us on these camps. Section 6 is a really confusing section. I'm sure most of you struggled with it. I know I did. And I didn't go to look at resources on it. I wasn't going to go and Google stuff. If I can't figure it out on my own, I just need to read it harder, is my thought. And I've still struggled with this. But we do see that violence has become much more frequent in town, and we see this as a powder keg. But then the rest of this is really a Theroux development passage, and that's because if I remember right, we're about to lose Theroux. I think he's one of the ones that die. I'm not reading ahead. I read this a while back, and now I'm revisiting it as I make these videos. But I don't want to read too far ahead because then I'll get confused with what's going on. But we have a lot of a conversation with Theroux talking about having the plague prior to this. I don't think he means the literal plague. I think he means that we all have this sickness inside of us, and he's going to go on and discuss it. And I kind of get it, but there's still some struggling. So let's talk about it a little bit. He discusses some of his past. He's giving us some backstory here about his father, who was a prosecuting attorney, who he's seen him in several cases advocate for the death penalty. And this impacts Theroux greatly as he sees his father as a person he doesn't recognize in this, and he begins to get very upset about it. And he even kind of dedicates his life to fighting against this sort of thing. He says executions and legal proceedings take on a special obsession and repulsion for Theroux at this point. But in his haste to fight this, he says, and I'm not sure how it works, but he says that people were put to death because of his beliefs and what he said. And he realizes that we're all guilty in a way of this behavior. Now, this is where it gets a little bit poetic and messy. And we probably are wandering into some of the philosophies of Camus here. And philosophy is murky. In a college, if you get the opportunity to take a philosophy class, I encourage you to do so. But good luck, all right? So around 251, we get this statement. Where we go? He says, "For the plague stricken and the peace of For the plague-stricken, their peace of mind is more important than human life. Decent folks must be allowed to sleep easy of nights, mustn't they? Really, it would be shockingly bad taste to linger on such details. That's common knowledge. But personally, I've never been able to sleep well since then. The bad taste remained in my mouth, and I've kept lingering on the details, brooding over them. Skipping a little, he says, I learned that I had had an indirect hand in the deaths of thousands of people, and that I'd even brought about their deaths by approving of acts and principles which could only end that way. Others did not seem embarrassed by such thoughts, or anyhow never voiced them of their own accord. But I was different. What I'd come to know stuck in my gorge. I was with them, and yet I was alone. When I spoke of these matters, they told me not to be so squeamish. I should remember that great issues were at stake. So he's pointing out that, his actions have indirectly caused death of people, and it bothers him. And it kind of starts painting a picture of why he was so set on doing things to try to save people's lives here. He's looking for his own kind of salvation in some ways, all right? Then going over to page 252, he points out, let's see. It says, for many years I've been ashamed, mortally ashamed, of having been, even with the best of intentions, even at many removes, a murderer in my turn. He says, I have realized that we all have plague, and I have lost my peace. I only know that one must do what one can do. Let me try that again. I don't know that one must do what one can to cease being plague-stricken, and that's the only way in which we can hope for some peace, or failing that, a decent death. He's basically saying we've got to find a way to quit being death bringers and be healers, and that's not easily done. And he says at best case we can hope for a good death. All right. Again, we're in a kind of murky area here. He continues to say on the next page, he says, each of us has a plague within him. No one on this earth is free from it. And I know, too, that we must keep endless watch on ourselves, lest in a careless moment we breathe in somebody's face and fasten the infection on him. He says, yes, Ryu, it's a wearying business being plague-stricken, but it's still more wearying to refuse to be it. That's why everybody in the world today looks so tired. Everyone is more or less sick of plague, but that is also why some of us, those who want to get the plague out of their systems, feel such desperate weariness, a weariness from which nothing remains to set us free except death. So if I'm going to stretch here, which I'll do, I have a feeling that this plague he's talking about is this selfishness within us that lets us focus on ourselves and in a way puts others at risk. Something I think that we need today to think about is the idea that we in a way this illness that goes in as the sickness, and we have so many more platforms to spread our sickness now. It's not just through conversation with the people around us or the rude things we might say. That keyboard is one of the biggest spreaders of poison I've ever seen in my life. Whether it's on your phone or whether it's on an actual computer, the way people use them today is honestly sinful, in my opinion. The things they say to each other, the things they instigate, is just God cannot be happy with our behavior. Since with some of the things we do on social media. Now, there's a very powerful passage at the bottom of page 253 on to 254. Let me read it. He says, we're still with Teru. He says, as things are, I'm willing to be as I am. I've learned modesty. All I maintain is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and it is up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with pestilence. So we can't be part of the sickness. We have to, either be. Now, he says it's victims or pestilences. I feel like you can either be part of, and he even mentions it in a minute, there's a third group that's the healers, and I think that's the group we need to strive to be a part of. Definitely not allied with the pestilence. Being a victim is something you can't help, but at some point we need to work to help those around us. Even if we remain a victim, we need to split. We need to have that slash, victim and a healer, to help others around us. All right. We have that other discussion because Teru's the one who's obsessed with the concept of saintliness, and he says, what interests me is learning how to become a saint. And then Ryu responds, but you don't believe in God. And Teru says, exactly. Can one be a saint without God? That's the problem. In fact, the only problem I'm up against today. So he's like, I want to be a saint. And he's like, that's a religious thing. He's like, can you be saintly without that? And that's an interesting question that actually is not answered. It's left there for us to think about. I will tell you that Teru behaves in a saintly manner. He gets out there and helps, and he's willing to accept what happens. He's there to do good, and I think doing good is a key element to this. Obviously, there's the religious element of if you're not a Christian, you have a different issue to deal with. But thank God there's people out there who choose to do good, since a lot of us as Christians don't. And I'm very disturbed that that's the case. All right, as we close, kind of a poignant scene. If you know what's coming, you realize how important this scene is. Those of you who read it and are not really paying attention may have seen this as kind of an awkward scene because Teru and Ryu decide to go and, have a swim together. They have passes that allow them to get into the bay. So they go and do that, and they spend this little bit of time just away from the plague as friends for a little bit. I have to remind you guys of something that I think is important detail here. We cannot take 21st century prejudices, sorry, I don't know what I was trying to say there, prejudices and ideas and apply them to older books, okay? The fact that these two guys go off to have a swim together does not make them in any way, shape, or form gay, which is, I know, what a lot of you said when you read this. That is not what's going on, okay? It is just, friendships for guys were allowed to be closer once upon a time. Today, we're so worried that people are going to think something weird that guys just don't have close friendships, a lot of us, and that's sad that we can't do that. I mean, that's disturbing, but there's nothing that's happening here that should cause you to think that. They're just spending a little bit of time together because if I know Teru's going to get sick. I don't remember if he dies from it or not, but he's definitely about to end up with plague. So they get this last minute. These two guys have been working together and have been working hard. And they haven't had time for a friendship, and they're getting some moments finally just to be friends and be around people who aren't dying, and that's kind of a key thing. But that ends section 6, actually, is that little scene, and it sets us up for the last little bit of the book. Let's see. Yeah, because we've got one more section in book 4, and then we get into book 5, which is the last one, and we start wrapping things up. Now, like I've told you, I can be convinced I'm wrong. I kind of think we're past our climax and we're in falling action right now, but you can make some argument on the other side if you would like to try. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this. I hope that it's been useful, and we are going to tackle the last couple parts of this here in the next 2 videos, and then we're going to be out of this. And some of you will definitely be excited about that and ready to move on, but we're about to get into Beowulf, so I don't know if that's going to be better or worse for some of you, but hopefully it'll be enough that you guys will read it and we'll be able to at least have a little bit better conversation. So anyway, thank you for your time. I don't know why I left The Great Gatsby in front of the computer. I just noticed it was there. That was from my last video, but hey, if you haven't read that book, check it out. Mr. Morse's favorite book right here, The Great Gatsby. So if you got a little bit too much of the plague and it's just giving you a little bit of a downer, read this book, because I don't think there's anybody on the planet besides F. Scott Fitzgerald who can write that well, and he's amazing. So give it a shot, all right? Side note there, I suppose. Unplanned. All right, guys, well, have a wonderful evening, and come back and listen to some more about the plague. Give it a chance. Let's get this thing finished.